She didn't flinch. That was the part no one could explain later. Not the elders, not the guards, not the wolves who had watched 100 beatings in that courtyard and looked away every single time. Lyra Ashvale stood in the middle of the Ironmore Pack's great hall, a bucket still in her hand. The floor still wet beneath her feet, and when Saren Blackthorn's palm cracked across her face in front of everyone, she did not fall. She did not cry out. She just looked up. And that was when the doors opened. That was when the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. That was when every wolf in that hall, alpha, beta, warrior, and elder alike, dropped to their knees without being asked, their instincts forcing them down before their minds could catch up. Because the man standing in the doorway wore a crown, and his golden eyes were not looking at the room. They were looking at her. The hand Saren had raised to strike again, he caught it midair, without looking at Saren, without breaking eye contact with Lyra, as if Saren were nothing, as if she had always been nothing. "Who?" said the Lycan King, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it silenced the entire world. "Touched what is mine?" Chapter 1. The world woke in stages. First, the wind threading itself through the pines that surrounded Ironmore territory like sentinels too tired to stand straight. Then the birds, cautious and quiet. Then the pale gray suggestion of morning pressing against the dark, not yet committed to becoming light. And then Lyra. She was always before the dawn. That was the rule unspoken, like most of the rules that governed her life. Omegas did not sleep in. Omegas did not linger. Omegas rose before the pack opened its eyes, so that by the time the pack needed something, it was already done. By the time the pack was hungry, the fire was already lit. She moved through the pack house the way water moves, finding the lowest path, the quietest route, the way that caused the least disturbance. Her feet knew every creak in every floorboard. She had memorized them the way other girls memorize songs. The bucket was heavy. It always was. She carried it from the well at the edge of the courtyard to the kitchen twice, then 3 times, her breath misting in the cold morning air, her hands red from the rope and the chill. She did not complain. There was no one to complain to. And even if there had been, she had learned long ago that the sound of her own voice asking for relief only ever made things worse. This was the Ironmore Pack. Prosperous, people called it. One of the strongest territories under the Lycan King's dominion. 5 packs fell beneath his rule, and Ironmore wore its status like armor always polished, always visible. The pack house itself was a grand stone structure, 3 stories high, hung with banners the color of charcoal and deep red. The wolves here were well-fed, well-trained, and deeply aware of their own importance. At the top of it all sat Alpha Cordon, broad-shouldered, loud-laughing, the kind of man who filled a room not with warmth but with pressure. He had never once spoken directly to Lyra. She was furniture to him. Useful furniture, perhaps, but furniture nonetheless. Below him, the betas moved in tight clusters of loyalty and calculation. They competed for his favor the way wolves competed for meat openly, without apology. And below them, the rest of the pack arranged itself in careful, anxious order. And below all of them, below rank, below consideration, below the threshold where most wolves even bothered to look, was Lyra. Omega. The word had weight. It pressed on her shoulders every morning when she rose, and stayed there until she finally closed her eyes at night. It was not simply a rank. In Ironmore, it was a verdict. It said, "You are the least of us. You exist at our convenience. You are here because we allow it." She had been 7 years old when they placed her here. She remembered very little of the night her mother died, only the cold, and the sound of rain, and the way the elders would not meet her eyes when they told her. What she remembered more clearly was the morning after, when Alpha Cordon had looked at her across the great hall and said, with complete indifference, "She stays as a ward of the pack." Ward. Another polite word for a thing no one wanted to name honestly. Her father had tried to fight it. She knew that now, though she hadn't understood it then. He had argued, petitioned, demanded, and then, within a month, he was gone. Disgraced, they said. Driven out on charges that no one would specify and no one would let her ask about. She had watched him leave from a second-floor window, and he had not looked up. She had always told herself it was because he didn't know she was watching. She had stopped believing that around year 3, the kitchen came to life around her. The pack cook arrived, glanced at the filled water vessels without acknowledgement, and began issuing instructions in a flat, tired voice. Lyra followed them. She was good at following instructions. She had made herself good at it the same way she had made herself small, made herself quiet, made herself the kind of presence that eyes slid past without catching. It was survival. Unbeautiful, unglamorous, unromantic survival. And then there was Saren. Saren Blackthorn did not arrive in rooms. She descended into them. Even at breakfast. Even in the casual disorder of a morning meal. She moved with the awareness of someone who had never once doubted her own welcome. She was beta-born, sharp-featured, and wrapped in a kind of cold beauty that the pack had long since mistaken for grace. Wolves stepped aside for her without thinking. She smiled only when it served a purpose. She passed through the kitchen doorway, and her amber eyes swept the room, cataloging, assessing, dismissing. They landed on Lyra for exactly the length of time it took to confirm she was there and beneath notice. Then moved on. Lyra lowered her head and kept working. That night, as she did every night, she slipped away to the small storage room off the back corridor. It was the one place in the pack house that no one claimed, because it held nothing anyone wanted. Broken shelving, old rope, the smell of dust and forgotten things. She sat in the dark and let herself breathe. And then it came the way it always came, without warning, without explanation. A light. Soft and silver, rising beneath the surface of her skin like moonlight, trapped in water pulsing once, twice, then fading before she could lift her hand fully into the air to look at it. She stared at her palm in the dark. Every night, the same thing. Every night, gone before she could hold it. She did not know what it was. Outside, beyond the tree line where the dark pines pressed close against the edge of Ironmoor territory, something moved. Still. Watching. And unlike Lyra, it knew exactly what that light meant. Chapter 2. The message arrived on a Tuesday. A single writer. Royal seal pressed in black wax on cream paper. He handed it to Alpha Corden without dismounting, turned his horse, and was gone before the dust settled behind him. By Wednesday morning, every wolf in Ironmoor knew. The Lycan King was coming. The effect was immediate and total, the kind of panic that disguises itself as productivity. Wolves who had never once cared about the state of the packhouse floors were suddenly deeply, personally invested in them. The banners were taken down, beaten clean, and rehung. The kitchens were restocked. The grounds were raked until the gravel lay in perfect, anxious lines. It was a once-in-a-decade event, a formal inspection of all 5 territories. The king would ride through each pack, assess its health and governance, and move on. He would be here for perhaps 2 hours. 2 hours, and Ironmoor had been preparing for 6 days. Lyra had been preparing too, only her preparation looked different from everyone else's. More floors to scrub, more linens to press, more fires to lay, more water to carry, more invisible labor vanishing into the walls of the packhouse, as it always did. Noticed only when it went undone. She did not think about the king's arrival the way the others did. She did not have the luxury of thinking about it at all. She simply kept working. Saren, however, had thought of almost nothing else for 6 days. She had been strategic about it in the way she was strategic about everything, quietly, thoroughly, without letting anyone see the full shape of her intentions. She had positioned herself for years, cultivated relationships with the right betas, kept her rank visible, and her reputation clean. She was the obvious choice. Everyone in Ironmoor knew it, even if no one said it plainly. The king had no chosen mate. The king had no queen. And Saren Blackthorn, beta-born and beautiful, and absolutely certain of her own worth, had decided a long time ago that she intended to change that. She had selected her clothing 4 days before his arrival. She had rehearsed her composure in the mirror until it looked effortless. She had mapped, precisely, where she would stand in the great hall 3 steps from the Alpha's right, visible from the door, lit by the morning light that came through the eastern windows at exactly the right angle. Every detail had been planned. Every detail except one. The morning of the inspection, Lyra was in the great hall before sunrise. The room was vast and cold and quiet, in the way that important rooms are quiet like they know something is coming. She moved her mop across the stone floor in long, even strokes, working from the far wall toward the center, the bucket of water trailing behind her. She was halfway done when she heard the footsteps. She knew them before she looked up. She knew the particular cadence of those heels, the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of someone who expected the world to wait. Saren stood in the doorway. She was already dressed. Every detail in place, hair arranged, posture set, expression calibrated somewhere between regal and approachable. She looked exactly the way she had practiced. And then her eyes found Lyra, and the mop, and the wet floor spreading across the exact center of the great hall. The silence lasted 3 seconds. "What?" Saren said, very quietly. "Are you doing?" Lyra kept her voice level. "Cleaning the hall. I was asked to have it done before." "I can see what you're doing." Saren stepped into the room, and her voice dropped in the way that was somehow worse than shouting. "You are leaving streaks on the floor that the Lycan King is going to walk across in 2 hours. You are standing in the center of this room with a dirty bucket like an embarrassment to every wolf in this pack." She stopped 3 feet away. "Get out. I still have half the floor." I said get out. The hall had begun to fill. Quietly, the way wolves gathered when they sensed dominance being performed not to intervene, but to witness. The alpha had taken his position near the head of the room. The betas flanked him. The elders stood at the edges, everyone watching, no one moving. Lyra reached down to pick up her bucket. She never made it. The slap was open, palmed, and precise, and it rang off the stone walls of the great hall like a crack of ice breaking on a winter lake. Lyra's head turned with the force of it. She stood very still for a moment, one hand on the bucket handle, the other at her side. The left side of her face burned. The hall was absolutely silent. She straightened. Not fast, not dramatic. She simply straightened. And when she lifted her eyes to Saren's face, there was something in them that hadn't been there a moment before. Not rage, not tears. Something quieter than both, and somehow more unsettling. A stillness so complete it had edges. Saren's hand was already rising again, and the doors opened. No one announced him. That was the first thing the absence of ceremony, the lack of any warning beyond the sudden, absolute drop in temperature that preceded him like a tide going out before a wave arrives. He walked in alone, 3 steps ahead of his guard. Dark coat, a crown that sat on his head with the casualness of something that had always belonged there. He was younger than the rumors suggested, and more dangerous than the portraits allowed. His golden eyes moved across the room once. Then they stopped. They stopped on Lyra. Not on Alpha Corden, who had straightened to his full height. Not on Saren, who had arranged herself precisely for this moment. Not on the banners or the clean floors or the carefully positioned wolves representing the best of Ironmore's strength. On Lyra, standing in the center of the room. Mop beside her, face still turned slightly from the blow, eyes meeting his without flinching, because she had not yet registered that she was supposed to look away. Every wolf in the hall dropped to their knees. Every wolf except Lyra, who was already standing, and the king, who had not taken his eyes off her since he walked through the door. The silence stretched. Saren's raised hand was still in the air. And then, without looking at her, without breaking eye contact with Lyra, without any shift in his expression at all, Cale Dravenmore reached out and closed his hand around Saren's wrist. He held it there, in the air between them, like evidence presented before a court. His golden eyes stayed on Lyra's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that it should not have carried across that room. It carried across that room. "Who," he said, "touched what is mine?" Chapter 3. He let go of Saren's wrist, like he was setting down something that had never been worth picking up. No words, no verdict, no glance in her direction to confirm she understood what had just happened. He simply released her and turned his attention to the room as though the last 30 seconds had not occurred at all. Saren's hand fell to her side. She stood exactly where she had been standing for 6 days in her imagination, 3 steps from the Alpha's right, lit by morning light from the eastern windows, and she had never in her life felt so completely invisible. The inspection lasted 40 minutes. Cale moved through the pack house the way winter moves through an open door quietly, completely, leaving everything it touched slightly changed. He asked precise questions in a low voice, and received answers that the Alpha gave too quickly, too eagerly, stumbling over his own words in a way he would spend days trying to forget. He examined the records, the border logs, the training yards. He looked at everything with the same expression, which was almost no expression at all. He did not look at Lyra again. Not once, in 40 minutes, did his gaze return to the center of that great hall where she still stood, mop handle in her grip, bucket at her feet, because no one had told her what to do, and she had not yet figured out where she was supposed to go. But he didn't need to look at her again. He had already seen what he came to see. At the door, on his way out, he paused beside the wolf, who walked always at his left shoulder, a man built like a closed fist, scarred along the jaw, with pale, quiet eyes that missed nothing. Commander Riven. His second. The king leaned close and said 4 words, too low for any wolf in the hall to catch. Riven nodded once. Kale walked through the doors and did not look back. The hall exhaled. It was almost audible, the collective release of breath from 30 wolves who had been holding themselves very, very still. Then came the noise, the movement, the careful performance of normalcy from people who were deeply, privately shaken. Saren recovered first. She was good at that. By the time the outer gates had closed behind the royal party, she had already begun reshaping what had happened into something she could survive. The king had intervened in a disciplinary matter, nothing more. He was fastidious about pack conduct. Everyone knew that. It reflected poorly on Ironmoor when wolves were seen striking subordinates in official settings. It was a protocol correction, an enforcement of decorum. She said this to the beta beside her, then to the one behind her, then, over lunch, to 3 more. By afternoon, the narrative had spread through the pack house like smoke because people wanted to believe it. The alternative required them to consider something none of them were ready to consider. Saren believed it too. She had to. Because if she was wrong, if the king's eyes had found the Omega girl first, for a reason that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with something Saren could not name yet, then 6 years of careful positioning had just become ash. She believed her own story. And she watched the door of the pack house from a window, and she waited, and she told herself she was fine. Alpha Corden did not believe it for a single moment. He dismissed everyone from his study by mid-afternoon and sat alone with the memory of those 40 minutes playing behind his eyes on a loop. The questions the king had asked, the rooms he had chosen to inspect, the exact, unhurried trajectory of his gaze when he first walked through those doors. Why the Omega girl? The question bored into him the way a splinter does small at entry, maddening with time. Lyra Ashvale was nothing. She had always been nothing. He had made sure of that. He had been very, very careful to make sure of that. Hadn't he? He went to his private files first. Then the pack's archived records. Then, with hands that he refused to acknowledge were unsteady, he accessed the secondary filing room at the back of the administrative wing, the one that held the older documents, the ones that predated his leadership, the ones no one requested because no one remembered they existed. He found it in the 3rd box, a page, old enough that the ink had gone gray at the edges. A list of names under a royal heading he was never meant to see, a sealed record from the Lycan King's palace, misfiled here decades ago in some long-forgotten administrative error. He read it once. His jaw tightened. He read it again to be certain. Then he tore it from the file, crossed to the fireplace, and held the page over the flame until it was gone, until the ash broke apart and rose in thin gray wisps up the chimney and vanished into the Ironmoor sky. He stood at the fireplace for a long time after that. Then he went back to his desk, sat down very carefully, and began to think about how much trouble he was in. Lyra did not know any of this. What she knew was that Commander Riven had appeared at her side shortly after the king's departure, guided her out of the great hall with a hand that did not grab, simply directed and installed her in a guest chamber on the packhouse's 2nd floor, with the quiet authority of someone who was not asking for agreement. He told her she was to remain here until further notice, by royal order. She asked why. He said he was not at liberty to say. He closed the door. She heard no lock turn, but she also heard him settle into position just outside it, and she understood that this was protection rather than imprisonment. The distinction felt important, even if she couldn't fully explain why. She sat on the edge of the bed, a real bed, with a frame and a proper mattress, not the pallet she'd slept on for 7 years, and looked at her hands. The left side of her face still ached faintly. but no one was hitting her. For the first time since she was old enough to understand what her life had become, she sat in a room that felt, if not safe, at least temporary. Like something was shifting beneath the surface of the world. Like the ground was moving in the dark and she couldn't see where it was going, only that it was going somewhere. An hour later, a knock. She opened the door to find Riven standing there, expression unchanged, holding something small between his fingers. He placed it in her palm, without ceremony. A carved wolf token. Dark wood, worn smooth at the edges. The markings along its body were unlike anything in Ironmoor older than anything she recognized. Something about the weight of it, the particular shape of it, made her chest tighten in a way she could not name. She looked up. "What is this?" "From the king," Riven said. "What does it mean?" He held her gaze for one measured beat. "I was not told," he said. And then he pulled the door closed. She stood in the center of the room with the token in her palm, and the weight of it pressing against her skin, like a question she didn't have the language to answer yet. Outside the window, the sun was going down over the Ironmoor tree line. Somewhere beyond those trees, a king who had not explained himself was riding back to his palace. And in a fireplace at the end of the hall, the last piece of paper that might have told Lyra the truth about her own name was already gone. Chapter 4. She did not sleep. Not because the room was unfamiliar, though it was. Not because the bed was strange beneath her, though that too was true. She did not sleep because the token was in her hand, and something about holding it made sleep feel irrelevant, like a thing that belonged to a different version of her life. The version that ended sometime around the moment a king's golden eyes found her face across a crowded hall. She sat cross-legged on the bed and turned the token over in her fingers. It was small, smaller than her palm. Dark wood, not the pale timber of the Ironmoor forests, but something older, denser, the kind of wood that came from trees that had been growing long before the packs were named. The wolf carved into its surface was mid-stride, head low, detail precise in the way that only patient hands could manage. Along its flank, a series of markings ran in a language she had never been taught. She traced them with her thumb, and that was when it happened. Not pain, she was braced for pain, had been braced for it for so long that it was almost her default expectation. But this was not pain. This was something that moved through her chest, the way a door opens sudden, swinging wide, letting in air that had been sealed away so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe fully. Recognition. That was the only word for it, inadequate as it was. Her fingers knew the shape of those markings before her eyes finished reading them. Her blood seemed to lean toward the carved wood the way a compass leans north. Not a choice, not a thought, simply an orientation. A pointing toward. She pulled her hand back, pressed it flat against her knee, stared at the token on the bed cover in front of her like it had spoken. It hadn't, of course. It was a piece of wood. It was nothing. It meant nothing. She picked it up again within seconds. Hours passed. The pack house settled into its nighttime quiet around her, the particular silence of a building full of sleeping wolves, breathing slow, guard shifts minimal. Outside her door, she could hear Riven's steady presence. Beyond the window, the Ironmoor pines stood dark against a sky scattered with cold stars. She was still holding the token when it began. It started at her fingertips. A warmth not external, not from the wood, but from inside her own skin, rising from somewhere so deep she couldn't locate its origin. She looked down at her hand and watched the light come. Silver. The same silver that had visited her nightly in the storage room and vanished before she could catch it, but not like that. Not shy, not brief, not uncertain of itself. This time it came like it had been waiting. It moved from her fingers to her palm to her wrist, spreading in branching patterns beneath her skin like veins of moonlight, steady, pulsing, intensely, overwhelmingly alive. It reached her arms, her collarbone, her face. She could feel it behind her eyes. She could feel it in the soles of her feet. The last thing she remembered was looking at the window and seeing her own reflection in the dark glass, luminous, unrecognizable, lit from within like something the night had no category for. Then nothing. In the corridor, Commander Riven had been awake. He was always awake. It was less a discipline than a condition, the particular alertness of a man who had survived his life by never fully surrendering consciousness. He sat with his back against the wall beside Lyra's door, arms folded, breathing steady. He saw the light before he understood what he was seeing. It came from under the door in a thin, bright line, then widened as it intensified, bleeding across the floorboards in both directions, filling the corridor with a cold silver radiance that had no business existing inside a pack house in the middle of the Ironmoor night. He was on his feet without deciding to stand. His hand went to his side without deciding to move. Every instinct he had, and Commander Riven had very finely calibrated instincts, was screaming something at him. Not alarm exactly, but its close cousin. Awe. The specific awe of recognizing something so far above your rank that all your training becomes temporarily irrelevant. He stood in that silver light for 30 seconds. Then it faded. He did not open the door. His orders did not include opening the door. He stood in the returning darkness for a long moment, then pressed his back against the wall, slid slowly down it until he was seated again, and sent a message to the palace that contained considerably more than one word this time. At the royal palace, Kale was not sleeping either. He stood at the window of his private study, a large room that managed, despite its size, to feel like a space built for one person to be alone in, and looked out at the dark that pressed against the glass. His hands were loose at his sides. His expression was the one his council had learned to be cautious about, not cold, not distant, but interior, occupied with something they could not see and he would not share. His wolf was quiet. That was the thing. That was the enormous, bewildering thing he could not stop turning over in his mind. Since his 18th year, the year the Lycan bloodline announced itself inside him like a second heartbeat, restless and ancient and constantly searching, he had not known a quiet night. The bloodline wanted what it wanted. It had always wanted. It did not rest. It did not settle. It moved through his sleep like a current through dark water, pulling toward something it could not find, growing more insistent with every passing year. Tonight it was still. Completely, profoundly, inexplicably still. Like something that had been searching for a very long time had finally been able to stop. He heard the knock at the study door without turning. Come. His council filed in 4 of them, which meant they had been waiting, had coordinated, had decided collectively that this conversation needed to happen tonight. He recognized the formation. He had seen it before at treaty discussions and border crises. They had prepared. The Northern Alliance needed a decision. Lord Fenrath's daughter was available and politically advantageous. The Eastern Pacts were watching the question of the king's succession with increasing anxiety. The stability of the entire 5-territory dominion was, in the carefully chosen words of his chief council member, intimately connected to the question of a chosen mate. Kale listened to all of it. His wolf stayed quiet throughout. When they finished, he thanked them, told them he would consider everything they had raised. Then he looked at them with the particular quality of attention that had ended arguments before they began, and they filed back out with the careful movements of people who understood they had not made the progress they came for. The door closed. In the armchair at the back of the study, Elder Voss had not spoken once during the entire exchange. He was a small man, slight, silver-haired, older than anyone in the palace could reliably confirm. He had served 2 kings before KL. He understood power the way cartographers understand geography, not by moving through it dramatically, but by reading it precisely, patiently, from the right distance. He watched Kale turn back to the window. He watched the set of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness, the careful absence of expression that meant the most was being felt. Voss said nothing aloud. But when he left the study 30 minutes later, he walked directly to the palace's lower archive and began pulling records that had not been touched in nearly 2 decades. His old hands moved through the files with practiced efficiency, unhurried, certain of what they were looking for. Records of the last Lycan Queen. Records of her final months. Records of what and who she had left behind. Neither of them knew, in those separate silences, the king at his window, the old man in the archive, that the test had already been answered. That the wolf token carved from ancient Draven wood, placed in the hand of a girl who did not know her own name, had done what it was sent to do. It was not a gift. It was never a gift. Royal Lycan blood, when it encountered that particular wood carved in that particular pattern, sealed with that particular lineage, responded in one way and one way only. It answered. It rose. It lit the night from the inside. Lyra had held the token for less than 3 hours. She had lit a corridor so brightly that a seasoned king's guard had pressed his back against a wall and forgotten, for 30 seconds, how to be unimpressed. She had done it in her sleep. She had done it without trying. And in the morning, she would wake with no memory of any of it, only the token still warm in her palm, and the strange, inexplicable feeling that something in the world had shifted a half-degree in a new direction. She was right. It had. Chapter 5. Saren did not go to the guard directly. She was too careful for that, too practiced in the particular art of getting what she wanted, without leaving fingerprints on the wanting. She went through channels. A beta she had favored with small loyalties over the years. A word passed sideways. A question framed as concern rather than curiosity. By the time the information reached her, it had traveled through enough hands that no one could trace it cleanly back to its source, which was exactly how she preferred things. She received it over breakfast, delivered quietly into her ear by the beta who owed her, and she sat very still for a moment, with her cup halfway to her lips, and the information settling through her like cold water, finding cracks in stone. Silver light, flooding under the door. The guard shaken enough that he'd told someone, which meant he'd been frightened enough that caution had lost to the need to be witnessed. She set her cup down. She did not look frightened. She was not frightened, or rather, she took the fear and did what she always did with emotions that threatened to make her weak. She turned it, compressed it, fed it into something more useful. Calculation. If Lyra Ashvale was somehow significant, if there was something in that gray, hollow-eyed Omega girl that had drawn a king's gaze and produced silver light in a locked room at midnight, then Lyra Ashvale was not nothing. And if Lyra was not nothing, then Lyra was a problem. And problems, in Saren's experience, were always better handled before they became too large to manage quietly. She went to Alpha Cordon before noon. She framed it carefully. She always framed things carefully. A security concern, she called it. An anomaly that the pack had a responsibility to investigate strange energy, unexplained phenomena, a ward of the pack exhibiting behavior that no one could account for. The king had placed the girl under protection, yes, but the pack's duty to its own stability surely superseded a vague royal instruction delivered without explanation. She watched Cordon's face while she spoke. She had expected to find skepticism there, or territorial defensiveness, or the particular brand of masculine stubbornness that required her to approach from 3 different angles before he'd move. She had prepared for all of those. She had not prepared for what she actually found. He was already afraid. Not of what she was telling him he knew already. She could see it in the way he didn't react to the silver light detail, didn't question it, didn't ask her to repeat it. He knew. He had known something, at least, since before she walked into this room. And he was frightened in the deep, foundational way of a man who has done something that cannot be undone and has been waiting, for a very long time, for the consequences to arrive. He agreed with her before she finished speaking. Together, with the door closed and voices low, they began to discuss how to move Lyra out of the pack house without triggering the royal protection order, how to make it quiet, how to make it look like something other than what it was. Saren left the study feeling, for the first time since the king had walked through those doors, like she had her footing back. She did not notice, on her way out, the particular stillness of the corridor, the absence of the usual packhouse sounds, the way sound could carry, in old stone buildings, around corners that seemed solid. She did not notice Commander Riven at the far end of the hall. He had noticed her. Riven did not pace. He did not deliberate. He did not weigh options with the anxious energy of men who were uncertain. He simply assessed, decided, and moved. It was the quality that had made him useful to a king who operated the same way. He returned to his post outside Lyra's chamber, sat down, and composed a message in the particular shorthand he and the king had developed over a decade of shared work compact. Unambiguous, impossible to misread. One word. Move. He dispatched it within the hour. Then he settled back against the wall and waited, with the patience of someone who understood that the next move was not his. At the palace, Elder Voss did not knock when he entered the king's study. He never knocked. It was one of the few privileges Kael had never revoked, partly because revoking it would have required a conversation about why, and Voss had a way of making those conversations uncomfortable in the manner that only extremely honest people could manage. He placed the file on the desk. Kael looked at it, then at Voss, then back at the file, with an expression that gave nothing away because he had spent 26 years perfecting an expression that gave nothing away. Voss sat down across from him without being invited, and folded his hands on his knee and waited. The file contained 3 pages. Old paper, careful handwriting, the kind of documentation that was never meant to leave the archive it had been buried in. Names, dates, a lineage record that ended where it shouldn't have ended abruptly, deliberately, with the practiced neatness of someone erasing a thread they hoped no one would follow. A name at the top of the page, the last Lycan Queen, and below it, a second entry, a daughter. Age at last confirmed record 7 years old. Location at time of recording unverified. Assumed deceased by the king's enemies. Never confirmed. Voss let the silence sit for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, "You've seen this before." It was not a question. Cale did not insult him by pretending otherwise. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, and let out a breath that carried more weight than it should have, from a man who never visibly carried weight at all. 3 months ago, he said, a contact in the Eastern Archives. It took her 4 years to find it, and 2 more months to get it to me without being intercepted. Voss absorbed this. And Ironmore. Was the last location the Queen mentioned? In the last correspondence we have from her? A name. A pack. No details beyond that. He paused. I needed to see her myself. I needed to be certain before I moved. The old man was quiet for a moment. Outside the study windows, the palace grounds lay in the gray afternoon light, perfectly still. "And are you?" Voss asked. "Certain?" Cale's jaw tightened barely, the smallest movement, visible only to a man who had been reading his face for 8 years. "I knew the moment I walked through the door," he said. "Before I saw anything. Before I saw her." Voss looked at him steadily. "That is the bond." "Yes. You didn't expect that." A pause. "Longer than the others." "No," Cale said quietly. "I didn't expect that." Because that was the part he had not prepared for. He had prepared for everything else, the search, the politics, the danger of extracting a hidden heir from a hostile pack without triggering the very people who had buried her there. He had made contingency plans and backup contingency plans, and had spent 3 months thinking about every possible version of how this could unfold. He had not planned for the doors of that great hall to open, and the bond to hit him like a physical force, ancient and immediate, and completely indifferent to his carefully constructed composure. He had not planned for his wolf, restless since his 18th year, to go absolutely silent the instant his eyes found her face. He had made a vow to a dying woman 15 years ago, kneeling on cold stone beside a queen who had used the last of her strength to grip his hand and say her daughter's name. He had been 17. He had promised because it was right, because she was dying and frightened, and because some things simply demanded to be promised. He had not imagined, at 17, that the daughter would be his mate. The universe, it turned out, had not asked for his input. Voss watched him with the particular quality of attention that had nothing in it of judgment, only the careful witnessing of a man who understood that some truths rearranged the room they landed in. Then Riven's message arrived. Cale read it, set it down, looked at Voss. "How quickly can you be ready to travel?" he said. Chapter 6. It happened fast. That was the thing about Commander Riven he did not build toward action. He did not signal it, or warm up to it, or give anyone the courtesy of anticipating it. One moment he was a still figure in a corridor. The next, he was moving, and everything in his path either stepped aside or got relocated. He came to Lyra's chamber before dawn. 3 words, "We are leaving." He gave her 4 minutes to gather what she had, which was almost nothing, because Lyra Ashvale had never been permitted to accumulate anything worth gathering. A worn coat, a change of clothes, the wolf token, which she wrapped in the corner of a cloth and placed at the bottom of the bag, without quite being able to explain why she wasn't leaving it behind. 4 minutes, and they were moving through the pack house before the pack was fully awake. Almost. Alpha Corden was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He had positioned himself deliberately shoulders square, expression assembled into something that was trying to be authoritative and landing closer to desperate. 3 of his senior betas flanked him. The message was clear. This was a wall. This was a no. Riven stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom and looked at him. Step aside, Alpha. She is a ward of this pack. Corden's voice was even, but his eyes moved to Lyra in a way that had nothing protective in it. Any transfer of a pack ward requires the Alpha's written consent, and a formal, "She is under royal protection by direct order." Riven descended the remaining steps at the same unhurried pace. "She has been since the day the king left. If you'd like to contest that order, I'll have the documentation forwarded to the palace, and the king can address it with you personally when he arrives." He stopped 2 feet from Corden. "Would you like that?" A beat. The betas shifted. Corden's jaw tightened into a hard, ugly line, the expression of a man who understood exactly how exposed he was, and had no move left that didn't make it worse. His eyes went to Lyra one more time, and in them she saw something she had never seen directed at her before. Not contempt, not indifference. Fear. He stepped aside. The carriage was plain, no royal markings, nothing that announced itself on the road. 2 drivers up front, 2 guards riding alongside. Riven sat across from Lyra as the packhouse fell away behind them, and the Ironmore pines closed in on both sides, dense and dark in the gray pre-morning light. She watched the trees pass. Then she looked at him. "Does the king know who I am?" Riven met her eyes. "Yes." "Am I in danger?" "You were in danger before this morning, less so now." "Am I a prisoner?" Something moved briefly in his expression, not quite warmth, but adjacent to it. "No." She turned back to the window. The road curved north, away from Ironmore territory, away from the only world she had known for 7 years. She should have felt more, she thought. Relief, or grief, or the particular vertigo of a life rearranging itself around her. Instead, she felt very quiet, like the part of her that processed enormous things had simply gone still and was waiting. She reached down and opened her bag. She was not looking for anything specific. The motion was automatic, hands needing something to do while her mind caught up to the morning. She lifted the coat, shook it lightly, checked the pockets out of old habit. Her fingers found the lining. A stiffness there that had no business being there. Not the seam, not a fold of fabric, but something flat and deliberate tucked into the space between the lining and the outer cloth. She turned the coat over, found the small, nearly invisible stitching along the lower hem that was different from the rest, newer, more careful, done by someone who needed it to hold for a long time and not be found. She pulled the letter free. The paper was thin with age. The seal had been pressed in plain wax, no crest, no marking, nothing that could identify it if it was found by the wrong hands. But the handwriting on the front was not anonymous. It said simply, "My Lyra." She recognized it the way she recognized the silver light, from somewhere below memory, from somewhere that didn't need to be taught. Her mother's hand. She broke the seal. She read it once quickly, the way you inhale sharply before understanding what you're breathing. Then she read it again, slowly, because the first reading had moved too fast through her, and she needed to let each sentence arrive properly before the next one could. Her mother wrote the way she apparently did everything without wasted words, without the luxury of softness. She had written this knowing she might not have another chance. Every line was precise. Every line mattered. "You are not what they told you you were." That was how it began. Not with endearment, not with apology, with the truth, offered immediately, like medicine. The Lycan Queen's bloodline had not ended with her death. It had been folded small, and placed in the lowest possible rank of the lowest profile pack in the Dominion, made invisible, made unthreatening, made into something no one would think to look at twice. It was not abandonment, it was architecture. Her mother had built her a hiding place out of humiliation and obscurity, and she had done it because the alternative was a grave. "I made you an Omega, so you could survive. I'm sorry it cost you what it cost you. I need you to understand it was the only wall I had left to build." Lyra's hands were not entirely steady by the 3rd page. She pressed on. The enemies who had moved against the Queen were organized, patient, and had reached inside every level of pack governance. They had been working for years to ensure that the Lycan bloodline ended cleanly, without heirs, without continuation. Her mother had spent her last months understanding exactly how deep the roots of that conspiracy went. She had found the source. She had written the name at the bottom of the final page, not in anger, not surrounded by accusation. Just the name, alone on the last line, the way you write something you need the reader to find without any possibility of misunderstanding. Alpha Gareth Corden of Ironmore Pack. He told them where to find me. He was paid well for it. He kept you after because he needed to know what you were, and because a dead Omega child draws more attention than a living servant. He has been watching you for 7 years to make sure you never became anything worth fearing. Lyra read the name twice. Then she folded the letter. Slowly, carefully, along its original creases, folded it the way her mother had folded it, pressing each edge flat with her thumbnail. She placed it inside her coat and held the coat against her chest. She looked out the window. The forest moved past in the dark, vast, and indifferent, and running alongside her like it had somewhere to be. She did not cry. She had done her crying in storage rooms and dark corridors and cold mornings when no one was watching. She had cried enough for a lifetime before she was 14. Whatever lived in her chest right now was not grief. It was something harder than grief. Something that had just been given a shape and a direction. Across from her, Riven watched her face and said nothing. He was good at reading rooms. He understood that this was not a moment for words. Outside the carriage window, the road north opened up ahead of them, wide and pale in the early light, running straight toward a palace where a king was already moving, already preparing, already waiting for something he had promised a dying woman he would protect. The name her mother died to bury was no longer buried, and Lyra Ashvale, ward of Ironmore, ranked Omega, invisible for 7 years by careful, loving, devastating design, was riding north with it in her hands. Chapter 7. The palace did not look the way she had imagined it. She had imagined it, over the years, in the small, guilty way that people imagine things they have been told are not for them. Grand gates, cold marble, the kind of beauty that announces itself loudly and expects to be thanked for it. The reality was quieter than that, and somehow more overwhelming. Stone that had been standing long enough to develop its own gravity. Towers that disappeared into low cloud. A courtyard that swallowed the sound of the carriage wheels the moment they passed through the outer gate, as though the palace had decided that noise was unnecessary here. Lyra stepped down from the carriage in her gray servant's clothes, with her worn bag over one shoulder and the letter pressed flat against her ribs inside her coat. The courtyard was not empty. Stable hands, guards, attendants, the ordinary population of a working palace going about its mourning. They looked at her the way people look at things that don't fit the expected pattern. Not rudely, not with the open contempt she was accustomed to, but with the particular attention of wolves whose instincts were registering something their conscious minds hadn't caught up to yet. They went still as she passed. Not all at once, one by one, like a held breath moving through a crowd. A guard's hand paused on a gate latch. An attendant stopped mid-step. A woman crossing the courtyard with a stack of linens slowed, then stopped entirely, watching Lyra's path with an expression she probably couldn't have explained if asked. Lyra kept walking. She had spent 7 years making herself invisible. She did not know how to make herself visible, and she was not trying to now. She was simply moving through a courtyard in gray clothes with her heart doing something complicated in her chest, and the palace was responding to her the way the earth responds to weather. Not to her intention. To her presence. Riven guided her inside without comment. The receiving room was small by palace standards. A fire, 2 chairs, a window that looked out over the northern grounds, where the tree line began its long, dark march toward the horizon. No attendants. No guards stationed visibly inside. No arrangement of furniture designed to remind a visitor of the difference between their position and someone else's. Kale was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when the door opened. For a moment, neither of them spoke the room, holding the silence between them like something fragile that both of them were being careful not to drop. Then Lyra said, "Why did you wait?" Not a greeting, not a preamble. The question she had been carrying since the carriage, since the letter, since 7 years of dawns that came before she was ready for them. He didn't flinch from it. "Sit down," he said, not as a command, but as an offering, as in, "This will take a moment, and I'd rather you be comfortable for it." She sat. He did not. He moved away from the window and stood a few feet from her, and she noticed that he had positioned himself without any furniture between them, no desk, no table, nothing that created the architecture of authority. Just a man in a room, choosing to be accountable. He told her the truth. All of it, without softening the edges. 3 months since the location reached him, buried under 2 decades of deliberate misdirection. Records destroyed, rerouted, replaced with false trails. 6 separate attempts to find her before that, 6 different messengers, 6 different investigative threads, all of which had ended in silence. 3 of the messengers, he told her, had not come back. He said it plainly. He did not perform regret or dress it in careful language. He simply laid it out like evidence, because she deserved evidence more than she deserved comfort. She listened to all of it with her hands in her lap, and her jaw set in the way of someone who is keeping their expression under strict management. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "And what am I?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You already know. I want to hear you say it." He said it. The last daughter of the Lycan Queen's bloodline, direct descent through the maternal royal line. The heir that his enemies had spent 20 years believing they had erased from the world, because it suited them to believe it, and because the woman who hid her had been very, very good at making things disappear. She had read those words in her mother's handwriting, in a carriage moving through the dark. She had processed them with the part of herself that processed necessary information efficiently, without fully feeling them. Hearing them from him was different. In a room with a fire and a window, and no one who could hurt her, hearing them spoken aloud by the one person in this world, with both the authority and the knowledge to confirm them, something in her chest that had been braced. For a very long time let go. Not collapse, not tears, just release. The particular release of a thing that has been held rigid for so long that relaxing feels almost structural. She did not kneel. He did not ask her to. He was watching her with those gold eyes that had found her face first across a crowded hall, and there was nothing in them of condescension or expectation or the performance of magnanimity. Just attention. The complete, serious attention of someone who understood that this moment was not about him. She straightened in the chair. And somewhere below the surface, below the anger that was still there, and the grief that would need time, and the enormous complicated architecture of everything, she was only beginning to understand something woke up. Not the silver light, not the shy, uncertain pulse that had flickered beneath her skin in dark rooms for years. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting with the particular patience of things that know they cannot be rushed. Her wolf. It did not rise gently. It did not introduce itself. It simply opened its eyes vast and dark, and absolutely furious in the way that things are furious, when they have been patient for far too long, and it looked at the world through her like it was deciding how much of it needed to burn. She made a small sound involuntary, quickly controlled. Her hand went to her sternum. Across the room, she saw Kael go very still. Not with surprise, with recognition. His wolf, ancient and quiet since the morning he had walked through the doors of the Ironmore Great Hall, answered, not loudly. It didn't need to be loud. It simply turned toward her wolf, the way a tide turns, certain and complete, pulled by something that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with nature. Neither of them spoke of it. The fire crackled. The window held its gray northern light. Somewhere in the palace, and the grounds beyond it, wolves looked up from what they were doing without knowing why, heads lifting, ears pricking, a ripple of instinctive attention moving through every wolf within reach of something they had no words for. Something enormous had just quietly begun. The room did not look different. The fire burned the same. Kael stood in the same place he had been standing. But everything had shifted the way the world shifts, when something that has been asleep for a very long time finally opens its eyes. Chapter 8. The summons went out before sunrise. No explanation. No agenda attached. Just the king's seal pressed into black wax, and a date 3 days hence, and the particular quality of royal brevity that did not invite questions because it did not need to. When the Lycan King summoned his alphas, they came. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. All 5 letters went out simultaneously, by 5 separate riders, so that no alpha would hear of it from another before receiving it himself. Kael had timed it that way on purpose. He did most things on purpose. Saren arrived on the 2nd day. She came without invitation, which required a specific kind of confidence, the kind that has never seriously entertained the possibility of being turned away. She had dressed with the focused precision of someone who understood that appearance was argument, that the right presentation could reframe almost any situation if delivered with sufficient certainty. Deep green traveling clothes, hair arranged, posture immaculate. She gave her name at the gate with the composure of someone expected. The gate guard checked no list, because she was on no list, because she had not been invited. He consulted briefly with a senior attendant, who consulted with someone above him, and eventually Saren was guided with perfect courtesy and no explanation to a receiving room on the eastern side of the palace's ground floor. It was a comfortable room. It had chairs, and a window, and a tray of refreshments that arrived promptly, and absolutely no indication of when anyone would come to tell her what happened next. She sat down. She crossed her ankles. She waited with the performance of patience, which is a different thing from patience itself. On the palace's upper floors, Lyra was learning what it felt like to be asked. Not told, not instructed, not handed a task and pointed toward it. Asked. What did she prefer for her quarters? The rooms facing the courtyard, or the ones that looked north toward the forest? Was she warm enough? Was there anything she needed that hadn't been thought of? She kept waiting for the condition attached. The thing she would have to do in exchange, the cost that would be named eventually once she had settled into comfort far enough that removing it would hurt. She had lived long enough in a world where nothing was given without that mechanism beneath it. The condition did not come. Elder Voss arrived on the morning of the second day with a leather satchel of documents and the energy of a man who had been waiting for this particular task for longer than was probably professionally appropriate. He was patient with her. More than patient, he was precise, which she appreciated more. He did not speak to her like someone being oriented to a new situation. He spoke to her like someone being returned to information that was rightfully hers. Pack law, bloodline succession protocols, the specific legal architecture of what her identity meant under the Dominion's governing structures, the rights attached to her lineage, the responsibilities. The complications, and there were complications, he did not hide them. There were people who would resist this, and systems that would need to be navigated, and none of it would be simple. She absorbed it the way dry ground absorbs rain completely, immediately, with the appetite of something that has been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. Voss watched her process a particularly dense passage of succession law, ask 3 precise questions that cut directly to the most contested interpretations, and then synthesize his answers into a clear conclusion that had taken him considerably longer to reach when he was 30 years younger. He made a small note in the margin of his own document. He did not share what it said. Alpha Corden arrived on the afternoon of the second day. He had composed himself for the journey. She could see that, from the far end of the corridor, in the set of his shoulders, and the deliberate evenness of his pace. He was a man who knew how to perform steadiness. He had been doing it for decades. He came around the corridor's long curve with his escort, and she was simply there, standing at the far end of the hall. Not positioned there strategically, she had been walking from Voss's study back to her own quarters, and the corridor intersection had placed them in each other's line of sight without planning or ceremony. She was in deep blue now, fitted and clean, with her hair loose around her shoulders, and no bucket in her hands, and no deference in the architecture of her body. She looked, the way she had always looked, and also entirely unlike anything she had ever been permitted to look like before. Corden stopped walking. His escort continued 1 step, then stopped 2, uncertain. Lyra did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood at the end of that corridor and looked at the man whose name was written in her mother's handwriting at the bottom of a page that had waited 7 years for her to find it. She did not need to do anything else. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked away. A small thing, a tiny, quiet thing, a flicker of avoidance that lasted less than a breath. But in 7 years, through every morning she had risen before dawn and every floor she had scrubbed, and every casual cruelty that had landed without consequence, Alpha Gareth Corden of Ironmore Pack had never once looked away from her first. His escort guided him forward. He did not look back. Lyra watched him go, and then she continued down the corridor toward her own rooms, and her expression did not change, because she was saving what she felt for when it would matter most. In the eastern receiving room, the refreshments had gone cold. Saren had rearranged herself in the chair 3 times without noticing. The window showed her the same courtyard it had been showing her for 2 hours' activity, movement, the ordinary business of a palace conducting itself without any apparent urgency about her presence in it. She heard voices in the corridor outside, courtiers passing, mid-conversation, unconcerned with being overheard. She was not trying to listen. But the walls in old palace buildings carried sound in particular ways, and the name came through the door as clearly as if it had been delivered directly to her chair. Lyra Ashvale, the Lycan Queen's daughter. Apparently she's been here since. The rest dissolved into footsteps moving away. Saren did not move. She sat in her green traveling clothes with her hair arranged and her posture immaculate, and the cold refreshments on the table beside her, and she did not move for a very long time. Because it was all there all at once, complete and fully assembled, every piece she had been holding separately suddenly arranging itself into its actual shape. The king's eyes finding a face before they found the room. The silver light under a locked door. The royal protection order that needed no explanation because it needed no justification. The wolf token. The carriage leaving before dawn. The way Corden had agreed with her so quickly, so desperately, like a man trying to close a window after the storm had already come inside. Lyra Ashvale. Gray clothes and a mop and tears drying on her face and 7 years of... Saren's hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened until her knuckles went pale. Her face did not crumble. She was too controlled for that, too deeply habituated to keeping her surface intact. But underneath the composure, something was happening that she had no armor for the specific, nauseating vertigo of understanding. All at once, the full and irreversible weight of what she had done. Not to someone beneath her. To the Lycan Queen's daughter. In front of the Lycan King. She sat in the waiting room in her finest clothes, dressed for a future that had just finished closing its door, and for the first time in her life, Saren Blackthorne had no next move prepared. Chapter 9. The council chamber had hosted wars. Not fought them, hosted them. The particular wars that happen around tables, in careful language, with documents and precedent used as weapons. The room understood weight. Its stone walls had absorbed decades of it, the way old stone does quietly, without comment, retaining everything. 5 alphas sat along the table's length, men who commanded thousands, men whose names moved through the dominion the way weather moves preceded by reputation, followed by consequence. They had arrived with the composure of people accustomed to being the most significant presence in any room they entered. They sat now with the particular stillness of men who were recalibrating. Kale was at the head of the table. He had said almost nothing since they filed in, greeted them with the economy of a man who considered courtesy a tool rather than a performance, gestured them to their seats, and then gone quiet in the way that his quiet always felt like pressure, applied from a great and patient height. Corden sat third on the left. He had arranged his hands on the table in front of him with visible deliberateness, the way a person arranges their face before a difficult conversation, consciously, effortfully, aware that the arrangement might not hold. The door opened. Lyra walked in. She was not announced. Kale did not stand, did not gesture, did not offer the room any framework for what it was seeing. He simply watched her enter, and then looked at the table and said, with the complete absence of inflection that made everything he said sound inevitable, "Take your seats. She will speak first." 4 of the 5 alphas did not know her. They saw a young woman in dark clothing, composed, unhurried, carrying a leather satchel, and moving through the council chamber with the ease of someone who had decided, privately and in advance, that this room belonged to her. Their wolves knew something their minds didn't yet. They shifted in their seats without understanding why. Lyra set the satchel on the table. She did not sit. She stood at the open end of the table, not at the foot of it, not positioned as a supplicant, simply present, the way a fact is present. Unavoidable. Already true before anyone had said it aloud. She opened the satchel. "My name is Lyra Ashvale," she said. "Most of you don't know that name. By the end of this session, you will understand why that was deliberate, who made it so, and what it means now that it cannot be kept quiet any longer." Her voice was level, not loud, not performed. She began. The letter came first removed from its careful fold and placed on the table where Elder Voss collected it, confirmed the paper's age and the writing's authenticity against samples he had sourced from royal correspondence, and set it within view of the room. Then the records Voss's own documentation, cross-referenced and annotated, the kind of evidence that had been assembled by someone who understood that this moment would need to be airtight. Then the wolf token, placed at the center of the table. Then, last, a single document in Voss's precise handwriting, a formal biological verification of Lycan royal blood, conducted under palace protocols, signed and sealed. She walked them through it in order. No flourish, no escalation of drama. Just sequence this, and then this, and then this, each piece connecting to the next with the clean inevitability of a structure that had been built to hold. She spoke for 11 minutes. Corden lasted until the 6th. "This is fabricated." His voice came out more controlled than she suspected he'd intended, tight at the edges, shaped carefully around the panic underneath. "These records are decades old. Chain of custody is unverifiable. Anyone could have." "The wolf token," Lyra said, without looking at him, without pausing, "is carved from Draven timber. Elder Voss can speak to its origin. The biological verification was conducted by the palace's own physician under royal oversight." She turned a page. "You're welcome to examine the protocols." He tried deflection next. "Procedural concerns. Questions of jurisdiction." The suggestion that the letters seal plain wax, no crest, represented a gap in provenance that the room should consider carefully before drawing conclusions. His voice got louder as the arguments got thinner. Lyra's did not change at all. She simply continued. Steady, precise, inexorable, the way water continues, the way time continues, indifferent to the noise made by things trying to stop it. She did not look at him with anger. She barely looked at him at all. She looked at the evidence, and she looked at the room, and she spoke with the controlled fury of someone who had waited 7 years for the truth to have a place to land, and was not going to waste a single word of it now that it finally did. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Cale let the quiet sit for exactly the right amount of time. Then he looked down the table and said, "Does anyone object?" 4 men said nothing. Corden opened his mouth. Cale looked at him. Just looked. The look of a man who has already decided and is giving the room the courtesy of a question he does not actually need answered. Corden closed his mouth. The stripping of rank was not ceremonial. It did not need to be. Cale spoke 4 sentences, legal, precise, final, and Gareth Corden of Ironmoor was no longer a title or a power or a wall between a girl and the truth about her own life. He was removed from the chamber by the King's Guard with the quiet efficiency of something being corrected. The remaining alphas watched him go. No one spoke. Saren was brought in 10 minutes later. She walked through the door with her chin up. Lyra could see her deciding, in real time, to keep it there, to hold the posture, to perform composure until composure became real. She made it 4 steps into the room. Then her legs gave out. Not a dramatic collapse, no sound, no reaching for the table. Simply a slow, inevitable descent, as though her body had assessed the situation independently of her will and made a decision she wasn't consulted on. She went to her knees on the stone floor of the council chamber in her fine traveling clothes, and she stayed there, and she did not look up. The room waited. Lyra looked at her for a long moment. In that moment she held everything 7 years of mornings before dawn, of hands raw from rope and cold water, of looking away when Saren entered rooms, of the particular exhaustion of existing in a space where your presence was considered an imposition. She held the memory of a great hall and a sound that rang off stone walls and the way no one had moved to stop it. She held all of it, and then she made her choice. "Get up," she said. Saren looked up for the first time. "I am not my suffering," Lyra said, "and I will not make you mine." The silence that followed was a different quality from the silences before it. Those had been the silences of shock, of waiting, of held breath. This one was the silence of a room full of wolves who had just watched something they did not have a category for and were quietly beginning to understand who they were in the presence of. Not because of a name. Not because of a letter or a token or a bloodline verified by a palace physician. Because of a woman who had every weapon and chose, with complete clarity, not to use the cruelest one. Cale watched her from the head of the table. He said nothing. He did not need to. Chapter 10. 3 weeks is not a long time. It is not long enough to undo 7 years. Not long enough to fill in the particular hollows that are carved into a person by sustained, patient cruelty, the ones that don't show on the surface, but that you feel when you reach for something ordinary, like comfort, or trust, or the simple belief that a room will still be safe when you return to it. 3 weeks is not enough for any of that, but it is enough for some things. It is enough for a pack house to change hands, for a new name to be placed over an old door, for the wolves who had spent years performing loyalty to power to discover, with some discomfort, that the power had shifted and that the new leadership came not from conquest or political maneuvering, but from the quiet memory of a girl who had noticed, in the years when noticing cost her nothing because she had nothing, who had been kind. Lyra had chosen them herself. Not the strongest, not the most politically connected. The ones she remembered, the cook who had occasionally left extra food near her station without comment. The young beta who had once, and only once, stepped between her and a worse situation and then pretended it hadn't happened. The elder who had looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite apology but existed somewhere in the difficult territory between them. Small kindnesses. The kind that cost something in an environment where kindness was a liability. She remembered all of them. She had always remembered everything. The formal acknowledgement of the bond happened on a Tuesday, which felt, to Lyra, appropriately unromantic. Important things happened on Tuesdays. Ordinary days were where real life lived. The full court assembled in the palace's great receiving hall. Kale stood at the front of it, and for once the room was quiet not because it was afraid, but because it was paying attention, the specific attention of people witnessing something they understood, on some instinctive level, to be significant. He had offered her ceremony. She had declined most of it. She kept the parts that mattered, the formal words, the legal declaration, the public acknowledgement that transformed a private truth into a documented one, and released the rest. No elaborate staging, no performance of grandeur. When Elder Voss asked if she was ready to receive the crown, she said, "Not yet." The room absorbed this. Kale, standing beside her, did not look surprised. He had, she was learning, a remarkable capacity for not being surprised by her, or rather, for having already accommodated whatever she was going to do before she did it. It was both reassuring and slightly unnerving, and she had decided to find it endearing rather than alarming. She had one request first. They rode to Ironmoor the following morning. Just the two of them, and a small escort that Riven kept at a discreet distance because he had developed, over the past 3 weeks, an accurate instinct for when proximity was wanted and when it was not. The road south felt different traveled in this direction, the same pines, the same gray sky, but moving toward something rather than away from it. She did not speak much on the journey. Kale did not fill the silence. That was something she had come to understand about him. He did not treat silence as a problem to be solved. He simply occupied it alongside her, which was its own kind of company. The pack house looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing. It had always loomed large in her internal geography. The weight of it, the way it dominated her waking hours. Standing outside it now, in the flat afternoon light, it was simply a building, stone and mortar and windows. Significant because of what had happened inside it, not because of anything inherent in its walls. She went inside alone, down the main corridor, past the great hall, where the floors she had scrubbed caught the light the same way they always had. Through the back passage, narrowing as it went, until she reached the door at the end of it, plain wood, slightly warped at the bottom from years of cold. The storage room. She pushed the door open and stood in the entrance. It was exactly as she had left it. Of course it was. No one came here. Nothing had changed here. Time in this room had moved the way time moves in places no one inhabits. The broken shelving, the coiled rope, the smell of dust and disuse, and, underneath it, something she recognized as the accumulated presence of her own long solitude. She stood in that room for a moment. Let herself feel what it held, not wallow in it, not perform the grief of it, just acknowledge it honestly, the way you acknowledge a scar. It happened here. It was real. It cost something that will not be fully returned. Then she turned and left the door open, walked back into the corridor, and left it standing wide behind her, the dark of the storage room, visible, accessible, no longer sealed, a small act, almost nothing. The kind of thing that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what it meant. For every girl told she was less, for every wolf ranked below their own worth, for every hidden thing placed in darkness and told to stay there. She left the door open. Kael found her standing at the window at the end of the corridor. He came quietly and stood beside her without speaking, which was exactly right. Outside the glass, the ironmoor tree line stood dark against a sky going slowly. Amber at its edges, the particular color of winter light, letting go of a day. She felt him beside her. The bond between them settled the way it always settled when he was close, not loudly, not with the urgency of the moment in the receiving room when it first fully woke, but with the steady, a certain quality of something that knew it had nowhere else to be. She turned, and she smiled. Not a performance, not the careful, managed expression she had developed over years of navigating a world that punished openness. Something real slow to arrive, unhurried, starting at the corners of her eyes before it reached her mouth. The smile of someone who has stopped bracing for the next blow and discovered, with some surprise, that the world is still standing. He looked at her the way the king looked at her, which was the way no one had ever looked at her before him. Like she was the most significant thing in the room, like she had always been. From somewhere deep in the forest, a wolf howled. Long, clear, silver bright in the way that certain sounds are bright, carrying in them a quality of light that has nothing to do with the eyes. It moved outward across the 5-territory dominion, like a ripple across still water reaching the distant packs in the way that some things reach, not through air or sound exactly, but through the deep instinctive channels that connected wolves to one another beneath language and rank and politics. And they answered. One voice, then 3, then a dozen rising from different directions, different distances, different packs that had never coordinated and were not coordinating now. They answered because something in the sound demanded an answer, because something ancient had finally resolved itself, and the world of wolves, which understood ancient things, responded accordingly. The sound filled the corridor, filled the packhouse, filled the tree line and the cold amber sky above it. Lyra stood at the window and listened to the Dominion answer, and did not move, because some moments are complete in themselves, and this was one of them. On the windowsill of the storage room behind them, just visible in the low light, the wolf token sat where she had placed it before coming to the window. Dark wood, worn smooth at the edges. The silver markings along its surface glowing faintly, not brightly, not dramatically, just enough. A quiet light in a dark room, steady and certain. She did not go back for it. It had found her when she needed finding. It had done its work. This is not a story about a girl who becomes powerful. It is a story about a girl who was always powerful, and what it costs a soul to be buried, and what it takes to come back from that without becoming the cruelty you survived. The slap that was meant to keep her small was the last thing that kept her hidden. After that moment, nothing and no one could make her invisible again. Thank you for watching. If Lyra's story moved you, subscribe, share, and leave a comment below. This story was made for everyone who was told they were nothing. You were never nothing. You were just waiting for the right door to open.